Infantile love of Batman and other superheroes can be precursor to fascism. That's what Alan Moore said in an interview with The Guardian in 2022. That the widespread popularity of superhero films, the billion-dollar industry that has dominated the box office for the past 15 or so years, is a sign that millions of people are susceptible to fascism. I've been thinking about that quote a lot recently. The idea that Batman is a fascist story has been a common critique of the character for decades. It was even said by George Lopez in that Blue Beetle movie that nobody saw.
It's like Batman stuff.
Batman's a fascist.
See, he thinks Batman is a fascist, but hearing it come from Alan Moore has more weight. Alan Moore is an incredible writer famed for writing Watchmen, V for Vendetta, and The Killing Joke, which is one of the most acclaimed Batman stories ever written. To be clear, what I started the video with isn't the actual quote, it's a paraphrased headline version. The actual quote is longer and more nuanced. Moore isn't calling Batman a fascist, he's saying that the popularity of the character is a sign of the infantilization of American adults. The comic book fans are children who crave simpler times, crave black and white morality and strongmen who come in and solve society's problems. And I think he has a bit of a point. I don't agree with him completely. I mean, I like Alan Moore as a writer, but he has a tendency to oscillate rapidly between saying the wisest things I've ever heard and going full old man yells at cloud. A big part of his argument is, adults like superheroes? But superheroes are for kids! They were made for kids when I was a kid before some weirdo British wizard with a giant bushy beard reshaped the industry and made a bunch of mature adult superhero stories. I think that part of it is stupid. There are an endless number of brilliant, mature stories for adults that use superheroes as a framework, but the core of that interview, the idea that superheroes are inherently fascistic and that the popularity of the genre is tied to the United States' descent into fascism, that's an interesting idea that I have a much harder time dismissing. Hi, I'm Casey Jarms. I am a superhero fan, writer of superhero fiction, and hobbyist video essayist. In the past, I've discussed the fact that superhero stories are often very fiercely dedicated to the status quo and that they demonize revolutionaries and protect tyrannical ideals. Over the course of this project, I'd like to go deeper. I'd like to analyze if the very foundation of the genre is rotten. If the reason the reason I like superheroes is because superheroes are fascist. And the case study I'm going to use for this project is Batman, because Batman is the superhero. Superman and Spider-Man come close in popularity, might be closer to the ideal of what a superhero is in people's minds, but Batman has for a very long time been the most popular superhero. He's also, of the A-list superheroes, the closest to being a fascist. Over the course of this project, I'm going to be asking two questions. Number one, is Batman a fascist? And number two, are Batman fans fascists? And I wish the answer to both these questions was a definitive no, but the answers are a lot more nuanced and complicated. Part of the problem is that it's hard to say that Batman is anything because Batman isn't a character. He's 100 different characters written by 100 different writers in 100 different continuities. Bill Finger's version of Batman is different from Neil Adams' version of Batman, is different from Frank Miller's, is different from Grant Morrison's, Paul Dini's, Sam Hamm's, Tom King's, and Alan Moore's. There have been a lot of different Batman writers over the years, and each of them has made the character subtly different. So really, the best thing to do would be to look at a bunch of different versions of Batman in different continuities and see how many of them are fascists. I've decided to look at 10 distinct versions of Batman, each shaped by a different creator or creative team. I will go through each version and analyze the political implications of who Batman is, who he fights, and how he fights them. An admitted flaw of this project I have planned is that I'm not actually going to be talking about comics all that much. Only 2 of the 10 versions of Batman on my list are from comic book writers, one being Alan Moore's take, and the other being pretty obvious if you're familiar with my past work. The rest are all going to be from adaptations, and this is for a few reasons. I'm more familiar with adaptations than I am with the source comics, as are most of my viewers. People are not lining up by the millions to read the latest Batman issue, but they are lining up to see Robert Pattinson beat up whoever it is he's gonna beat up in the next one. Also, there are simply more comics than there are movies. It's a lot easier to watch 10 movies than read 10,000 comic issues. That's not to say that there aren't political things in the comics. Like, I could do very long essays about Batman murdering KG Beast, or that time the Joker became the Iranian ambassador to the UN. Yes, that happened. Yes, it was racist. And would you believe me if I told you that this was the conclusion to the story where Joker murdered Robin? But the problem is, I don't have the encyclopedic knowledge needed to talk as in-depth as I'd like about the political themes of Batman the comic book character. And to be fair, from what I've read, comics Batman is mostly fine. Adaptations of Batman have a tendency to make him far, far worse than he was in the comic. The second, third, and fourth worst versions of Batman on this list all come from movies. The worst is from the comics, though, which is why it made it into this project. You'll notice that I keep saying project, not video. That's because even though this video is inevitably going to be very long, it's also going to be incomplete. The sheer scale of this project is going to force me to split it into multiple parts. I'm expecting at least 6, maybe more. It will take me at least a year to finish all of them, so subscribe if you want me to eventually get around to explaining how one particular version of Batman is in fact a massive fucking fascist. Fascist. I've been told by commenters that I've mispronounced fascist, and I am definitely going to say fascist a few times in this video, but also, fuck it. You all know what I mean! Now, some of you may wonder, why am I inserting politics into a video about Batman? Because Batman is already political. All art is political. Billionaires are political. The police are political. Terrorism and revolutionaries and environmentalism and crime are all political. Even works that people don't think of as controversial are political. Like The Wire, a show where the police are corrupt, violent bastards, and The Andy Griffith Show, a show where the main character is a nice, friendly sheriff, are both political and both say something about law enforcement. And you'll say, The Andy Griffith Show isn't political, and actually I think that a show about the nice, friendly cops in the American South that came out when the main job of the police was to murder black people for drinking from the wrong water fountain is pretty damn political. Things can be political because of what they don't show just as much as what they do show. That's not to say that the Andy Griffith Show is racist, but portraying a patently false and idealistic version of the United States and law enforcement instead of engaging with the messy politics of the real world was a political choice made by that show's creators in much the same way that showing the corruption and futility of the war on drugs was a political choice made by the creators of The Wire. If your media franchise features a billionaire who lives a life of comfort because he inherited capital from his parents, that is political. If it features the police as corrupt monsters who hunt the protagonist, that is a political statement. And if it features them as kind, friendly allies to the protagonist, that is also a political statement. To be clear, political doesn't mean bad. Devoutly political art can be very good or very bad, but the point is, it can be very good. Alan Moore's work is incredibly political, and I like a lot of it. Also, I'm just gonna nip this in the bud. The word political does not mean the work features women or people of color or queer people in a prominent role. Like, it's ridiculous that people consider The Dark Knight Rises, the movie where Batman beats up pseudo-Occupy Wall Street protesters, to be non-political, but at the same time think The Batman is too political because that movie featured a black woman in it. Rubble, rubble, rubble. Those people are stupid and also racist. The thing is, you can learn a lot about American politics from watching Batman movies. Like, the 1989 Tim Burton movie features a dirty, crime-ridden city and a violent strongman who comes in and kills all the criminals. That movie came out in 1989 and is a reflection of the political attitudes towards crime and urban decay of that era. Similarly, it shouldn't be shocking that the Batman adaptation that came out in 2008 is about a dangerous terrorist who can only be stopped through torturing prisoners and mass surveillance. The Dark Knight is a movie that could have only come out in the decade after 9/11 because it is inescapably tied to the politics of the War on Terror. And refusing to analyze media as contributing towards or being influenced by the political climate it was birthed from is total bullshit. This project is not just about fascism, although fascism is the chief thing I'm going to be looking for in these works. Batman stories are also a good jumping off point to discussions of environmentalism, police brutality, billionaire philanthropy, prison rehabilitation, mental health care, government surveillance, Islamophobia, and a dozen other deeply political concepts. But still, the main goal of this project is to give a nuanced analysis of whether or not Batman is a fascist. And if we're going to do that, we should probably first define what fascism is. After reading hundreds of pages of essays and analysis of what fascism is, I can confidently say that fascism is fuzzy. And you assume that bit is a joke, but no, that's how it is described in Fascism, generally considered to be the definitive essay defining what fascism even is. Fascism was written by Italian novelist and historian Umberto Eco, who grew up in fascist Italy. In the essay, he recounts his youth under the dictatorship, how the country he grew up under raised him to believe he should die for the glory of Mussolini. Eco stresses that fascism is a contradictory mess. In Italy, it claimed to be revolutionary but was financed by the conservative bourgeoisie who feared revolution. Mussolini started out opposing the monarchy, then spent 20 years loyal to the royal family, then turned on the king when it suited him. And of course, the National Socialist German Workers' Party very famously rounded up and killed socialists and trade unionists the moment they seized power. Fascism is ideologically inconsistent about everything except a desire for power. But fascism isn't just a synonym for when the government does things I don't like. It's authoritarian, but it's a specific type of authoritarian. It is more complicated than racism, although fascists are very, very racist. The word fascist doesn't just mean bully, although fascists are bullies. Further complicating things is the fact that fascist movements are all very different from each other. Fascist movements have sprung up across the globe, and every one of them is terrible in its own unique way. To quote a 1944 George Orwell essay, it is not easy, for instance, to fit Germany and Japan into the same framework, and it is even harder with some of the small states which are describable as fascist. It is usually assumed, for instance, that fascism is inherently warlike, that it thrives in an atmosphere of war hysteria and can only solve its economic problems by means of war preparation or foreign conquests. But clearly this is not true of, say, Portugal or the various South American dictatorships. Or again, anti-Semitism is supposed to be one of the distinguishing marks of fascism, but some fascist movements are not anti-Semitic. Learned controversies reverberating for years on end in American magazines have not even been able to determine whether or not fascism is a form of capitalism. But still, when we apply the term fascism to Germany or Japan or Mussolini's Italy, we know broadly what we mean. He then goes on to explain that he'd seen the word fascist applied to every ideology under the sun, rendering it pretty much meaningless. But even if fascism is fuzzy and inconsistent, and even if the word is often misused, I do think that fascism is a specific thing, and I think it's important to understand what that is. In the Doctrine of Fascism, written by fascist Giovanni Gentile and Benito Mussolini, fascism is defined by a few key principles: the importance of tradition of the state, the rejection of individualism, pacifism, Marxism, democracy, egalitarianism, and economic liberalism, and by a belief in a totalitarian vision of the future, among other things. That essay gives a good insight on what Italian fascists believe and is a good starting point, but of course, it should be taken with a grain of salt. The Doctrine of Fascism is very flattering towards fascists, given it was written by a pair of them, and leaves out the more obviously vile and hypocritical aspects of the ideology. One of the more acclaimed books on fascism is Anatomy of Fascism by historian Robert Paxton. In this book, Paxton talks about a set of mobilizing passions that are the emotional lava that form fascism's foundations, a set of conspiratorial beliefs that center on the idea that the fascist is part of a chosen people whose lot in life has been stolen by a nebulous enemy. Fascism rises in times of crisis and is traditionally ushered in by a humiliated white middle class. Not by the poor who were historically drawn in by Marxism, but by the petite bourgeoisie. That means middle-class business owners, by the way. The problem with the fact that a lot of political philosophy was established in France is that I have to use the term bourgeoisie, a word I have never spelled correctly once in my entire life. In Italy, Mussolini found his first substantial support among landowners in the Po River Valley who felt abandoned by the refusal of the liberal government to send in the military to shut down strikes. The landowners turned to the black shirts, who beat, intimidated, and murdered socialists for them. Paxton also notes that the local police and army commanders either turned a blind eye or flat out supported this violence, and what a strange thing to happen. It's a good thing that the police ignoring fascist violence towards leftists, thus allowing fascists to seize power, is something that only ever happened in Italy that one time. In Germany, fascists found their early support among farmers dealing with collapsing cattle prices. And when the stock market crashed in 1929 and unemployment skyrocketed to a quarter of the country, Hitler only became more popular. The Nazis exploited the twin humiliations of the Great Depression and the Treaty of Versailles to seize power. The German government failed to address the crisis, and the Nazis offered salvation. For some, that is. They blamed the country's problems on the Jews and the Marxists and other minorities they wished to slaughter, and 37% of the German public ate it up. Paxton's mobilizing passions, the drives that push people to fascism, are as follows. Number 1, a sense of overwhelming crisis beyond the reach of any traditional solutions. Number 2, the primacy of the group, toward which one has duties superior to every right, whether individual or universal, and the subordination of the individual to it. Number 3, the belief that one's group is a victim, a sentiment that justifies any action without legal or moral limits against its enemies, both internal and external. Number 4, dread of the group's decline under the corrosive effects of individualistic liberalism, class conflict, and alien influences. Number 5, the need for closer integration of a purer community by consent if possible, or by exclusionary violence if necessary. Number 6, the need for authority by natural leaders, always male, culminating in a natural chief who is alone capable of incarnating the group's destiny. Number 8, the beauty of violence and the efficacy of will when they are devoted to the group's success. And number 9, the right of the chosen people to dominate others without restraint from any kind of human or divine law, right being decided by the sole criterion of the group's prowess within a Darwinian struggle. I think this is the best way to approach fascism in this project, from its beginning rather than its end. Because, to get back on topic, this is a mini-series about Batman! It's going to rest a lot more on the attitudes and grievances that drive people towards fascism than on the things the fascists do when they gain power. Like, there aren't any Batman stories on my list about him suspending elections or invading Poland. Those are things fascists do, but those are things that they do when they are in power, and Batman doesn't have that power in most of these stories. He's usually stuck in the mobilizing passion stage. Paxton's mobilizing passions are one of the 2 metrics I'm going to be using in this project. The other one is the previously mentioned essay, Fascism, which lists 14 features that define fascism. As I previously explained, fascism is fuzzy and inconsistent. These features do not on their own make someone a fascist. Most of them make you an asshole, but having 1 or 2 of them doesn't usually make you a Nazi. On the other hand, if you only exhibited 12 of the 14, you could still probably be referred to as a fascist. Whether or not someone is a fascist is a judgment call, but I think it is fair to call people who exhibit most of Umberto Eco's features fascists. The first feature is the cult of tradition. Fascists are syncretic, meaning they draw from and mix together many different ancient sources, even if they're contradictory, because of a belief in some ancient primeval truth of the world. Fascists hate the advancement of learning. To quote, "Truth has already been spelled out once and for all, and we can only keep interpreting its obscure message." Related is number 2, rejection of modernism. Fascists like new technology, yes, but their beliefs are centered on a worship of blood and earth. The Nazis, for example, believed in a mystical connection between themselves and Germany and called for a readoption of rural values. Fascists hate and reject the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, seeing them as the beginning of quote-unquote modern depravity. Side note, it's kinda bad that reject modernity, embrace tradition was a meme for a while. Number 3, action for action's sake. Thinking things through or reflecting is a form of emasculation. Also, fascists hate intellectuals. Number 4, no syncretic faith can withstand analytical criticism. Nuance and distinction is a sign of modernism, and modernism is the devil. Science uses disagreement to improve knowledge, but for fascists, disagreement is treason. Number 5. Besides, disagreement is a sign of diversity, and the appeal of fascism is as a weapon against intruders. Fascism grows by exploiting the fear of difference. Basically, fascists are racist and xenophobic. Number 6. Fascism is born from the frustrations of political classes facing humiliation or an economic crisis. It is the movement of those frightened by the pressure of lower social groups propped up by the old proletariat, now turned petite bourgeoisie. Fascism attempts to appeal to a frustrated middle class. Number 7. Fascism is rooted in nationalism, the belief among those deprived of a clear social identity that their nationality makes them superior. But the superiority requires an enemy to fight and hate. Fascists are defined by an obsession with a plot. They love xenophobia and conspiracy theories about some vast evil group that must be eradicated. The Deep State, or the New World Order, or the Illuminati are more modern names for the same belief, but the OG conspiracy target was Jewish people. And to be honest, those other conspiracy theories are also usually talking about Jewish people. Like, small tangent, but the anti-Semitism of conspiracy theorists is so intrinsic that I once had a man try to convince me that the protests over the Gazan genocide were secretly being arranged by the rich Jewish people he thought ran the country and also ran China and Russia and Mexican drug cartels and Hamas, but also he thought that Jewish people were a monolith who were all dedicated to Israel, and he saw no contradiction in any of this. It was nonsense, but he was a fascist, and see number 4 for how fascists deal with contradictions. Number 8. The enemy is both strong and weak. The enemy from the plot in number 7 is both rich and intelligent and controlling, but also genetically inferior and easily defeated. It doesn't make sense, but again, fascists ignore contradictions. Number 9. Life is lived for struggle. Thus, pacifism is trafficking with the enemy because life is permanent warfare. This leads to pushes for massive warfare and genocidal final solutions. What happens to fascists when they run out of enemies to kill? We don't know, because no fascist movement has gone that far. Yet. Number 10. Contempt for the weak. Fascists advocate what Eco calls popular elitism. The members of the party are superior to others, but the leader is also superior to them. Fascists hate their own underlings, thinking they are weak and need a ruler. Number 11. Everyone is educated to become a hero. Fascism is a cult of death that encourages men to die accomplishing their goals and to send others to their deaths. Number 12. Machismo. Fascists have a disdain for women and are intolerant towards non-standard sexual habits like homosexuality. Number 13. Fascists are in some ways populist, but also want to strip individuals of their rights. They do not fight for the actual people making up their country, but rather for this vaguely defined common will that never disagrees with them. Or, as Paxton puts it, selective populism. Number 14. Newspeak. Fascists regulate and impoverish language to limit critical reasoning. This doesn't mean, oh, the kids are saying insert new slang term? How authoritarian! And it doesn't mean, there are new terms for different sexual preferences or gender identities. That is done to expand and add nuance to conversations, which is the opposite of newspeak. Newspeak is when, for example, you start using the word groomer to simultaneously refer to child molesters, queer people, and anyone left of Reagan politically. It is removing nuance because when you remove nuance, you can just call people you want to exterminate pedophiles and kill them all. Of course, these 14 features are all linked to each other. The cult of tradition and rejection of modernism are two sides of the same coin. Fear of difference and the enemy is both strong and weak are tied together with obsession with a plot. Action for action's sake, pacifism is trafficking with the enemy, everybody is educated to become a hero, and machismo are all about this worship of masculinity and violence. Fascism is hard to define, but when you put all of this together, it makes sense. I mean, it's contradictory genocidal nonsense, but it's a very human form of contradictory genocidal nonsense. Like, here's how I view fascism. The world is scary and complicated, the economy is shit, you're afraid of crime, and then some strongman marches in and says you are superior. There's this vast conspiracy that hates you, that wants to humiliate you, but they're weak and you are strong. He says, give me power, and I will make you safe. Give me power, and I will make you strong. You'll be a hero. And those people who caused your problems, the communists and the immigrants and the Jews and the Muslims and the gay people and every other person you despise who made everything so fucking woke, I'll destroy them. I am the only one who can destroy them. I will make things go back to when you were a kid, when things were great. I'll bring back the good old days and the tradition that has been stripped away by this modern, secular world, and I'll hang the people you detest. That's the pitch. That's how I see fascism. Jumping back to Paxton, he noted that the building blocks for fascism exist in every country on Earth. He describes how an American fascist movement wouldn't look like the Nazis. You wouldn't see swastikas, and you might not even see anti-Semitism. In its place, you would see American fascists choosing black people or Muslims as the perpetrators of the plot. To quote, "The language and symbols of an authentic American fascism would, of course, have little to do with the original European models. They would have to be as familiar and reassuring to loyal Americans as the language and symbols of the original fascisms were familiar and reassuring to many Italians and Germans. Hitler and Mussolini, after all, had not tried to seem exotic to their fellow citizens. No swastikas in an American fascism, but stars and stripes, or stars and bars, and Christian crosses. No fascist salute, but mass recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance. These symbols contain no whiff of fascism in themselves, of course, but an American fascism would transform them into an obligatory litmus test for detecting the internal enemy. Around such reassuring language and symbols, and in the event of some redoubtable setback to national prestige, Americans might support an enterprise of forcible national regeneration, unification, and purification. Its targets would be the First Amendment, separation of church and state, creches on lawns, prayers in schools, efforts to place controls on gun ownership, desecrations of the flag, unassimilated minorities, artistic license, dissident and unusual behavior of all sorts that could be labeled as anti-national or decadent." And if you're thinking, hey, doesn't that sound like yes, it does. Both Paxton's and Echo's definitions of fascism are very good descriptions of MAGA Republicans, and that is very bad. Anyway, now that you understand fascism, let's talk about Batman. Alan Moore only ever wrote a few issues featuring Batman, but to be fair, he batted 1,000 with the character. Batman usually appears as a supporting character in Moore's comics. For the Man Who Has Everything is a Superman story, and the Batman annual he wrote, Mortal Clay, is told from the perspective of Clayface. Specifically, the third Clayface, Preston Payne, a man with a very tenuous grasp on reality who falls in love with the department store mannequin. Payne names the mannequin Helena and starts thinking it is alive. He turns violent when his wife is moved to a lingerie department and he sees a security guard feeling it up. Batman is sent in and Payne thinks that Helena is cheating on him with the Caped Crusader. I really like how this story ends. Payne has a breakdown and Batman holds his hand out to him, saying, "Let me help." Payne is sent to Arkham and Batman lets him keep the mannequin. I feel like there are two distinct ways of writing Batman. Some writers would have Batman say, "Ha! His guard is down," and then kick the shit out of Payne. But good writers have Batman hold out his hand and offer to help. Batman appears a few times in Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run, most notably in the issue The Garden of Earthly Delights, which was part of an arc where the police have the bright idea to arrest Swamp Thing's wife Abby on indecency charges because she had sex with a big plant monster. Swamp Thing turns Gotham into a jungle and threatens to destroy it if Abby isn't released. Batman tells Swamp Thing that Gotham can't surrender to terrorism. They briefly fight and Batman gets his ass kicked. Batman goes to the mayor and tells him to let Abby go, both because Swamp Thing is more than capable of destroying Gotham, and because Abby shouldn't have been arrested in the first place. The mayor pleads with this vigilante that the law makes an exception for, that the law can't have exceptions. Batman says if they want to be consistent, they should also arrest a bunch of alien superheroes who date humans, chief among them, Superman. Batman's role in the story ends with him telling Swamp Thing that if he ever hurts Gotham again, he will kill him, and Swamp Thing acknowledging that Batman might. The most notable Batman story Moore ever wrote is The Killing Joke. It begins with Batman going to speak with the Joker in Arkham. There were these two guys in a lunatic asylum. The narration begins before trailing off. Batman plays cards with the Joker, saying that he's been thinking about how it's inevitably going to end with them killing each other. This train of thought is interrupted when Batman realizes that the man he's been playing cards with is an imposter, Among Us, Ha ha ha. The real Joker goes to Gordon's apartment and shoots Batgirl, paralyzing her. He then kidnaps and tortures Gordon using photos of him sexually assaulting his injured daughter to try and push the commissioner over the edge. Small aside, this is a really good story, but it's kinda shitty that the defining moment of Barbara Gordon's life is a story where she is a minor character who exists solely to suffer and make other people feel bad. The nice thing about Alan Moore being a grumpy old man who hates the internet is that I never have to worry about him watching this video and casting a curse on me for criticizing him. As Gordon is tortured, we are given flashbacks of Joker's backstory. He was a failed comedian who turned to crime to support his family. His pregnant wife died, and he fell into a vat of acid, bleaching his skin. This one bad day pushed him over the edge, making him into the Joker. Also, the Joker is canonically good at sex. Okay, I guess that's a thing that I needed to know. I mean, it explains Harley, I guess? The Joker's plan in this book is to break Gordon, to make him go insane and become a supervillain. He's trying to prove in a way that he isn't crazy, that he was just an ordinary person, that anyone would become like him if they had one bad day. And he has a bit of a point. After all, you know who else had one bad day? Batman. Except, Gordon is fine. He's traumatized, he's been through a lot, but he's still the same Gordon. He tells Batman to take the Joker in by the book. He doesn't want vengeance, doesn't want to become evil, doesn't want to turn into the next flavor of the week supervillain. Gordon doesn't break because the Joker is wrong about people. At the end, after everything the Joker has done, Batman says that he doesn't want to hurt him. He wants to rehabilitate him. He doesn't want the Joker to be alone. He doesn't want it to all end with them killing each other. There's this question that Batman fans ask constantly. Why doesn't he just kill the Joker? And I think the Killing Joke gives the best answer. Because Batman sees himself in the Joker, sees a sad man who went through trauma and coped the only way he could by dressing up in a silly costume and playing cops and robbers. Batman can't kill the Joker, can't believe he's beyond redemption, because if he was, what would that say about Batman? If the Joker isn't a person anymore, then Batman isn't either. The Joker, in a rare lucid moment, tells him that it's far too late. He tells a joke about two men in a lunatic asylum. A joke about them planning to betray and kill each other. Batman laughs. He puts his hands on his enemy, and they laugh in the rain. And then he may or may not strangle the Joker to death. It's ambiguous. I mean, it was ambiguous when the story came out, and this was a non-canon what if. But then DC made the story canon because it was so good. So obviously, it doesn't actually end with the Batman killing the Joker. The ending of The Killing Joke is one of my favorite scenes in any Batman story. Moore was an excellent Batman writer, something that he would beat you to death with his bare hands if you ever said it to him. But the question is, does he write Batman as a fascist? No. Like, I'll go through our criteria, but I feel like it's fairly obvious that this version of Batman is not a fascist. Let's talk about the mobilizing passions that drive him. There is an overwhelming crisis beyond the reach of traditional solutions, but Batman doesn't really view himself as part of this superior group. There is no primacy of the group, belief that one's group is a victim, dread of the group's decline, need for a closer integration of a pure community, or belief in the right of the chosen people to dominate others without restraint. Batman is a male authority figure, and there is arguably an emphasis on his superior instincts, but Alan Moore's version of Batman emphatically does not believe in the beauty of violence. The Killing Joke ends with him trying to end things not through violence, but through empathy and mercy. Echo's traits are similarly absent. Cult of tradition, no. Rejection of modernism, no. Action for action's sake, hell no. This version of Batman believes in reflection. He believes that psychiatric help can rehabilitate criminals. Again, The Killing Joke ends with Batman trying to end things through a conversation. You could argue that the Joker, this mentally ill clown, could tie into the fear of difference, but that doesn't really fit, especially because Batman believes that he and Joker are the same deep down. Disagreement is treason, obsession with the plot, popular elitism, selective populism, and newspeak all don't apply to this version of Batman. Batman isn't middle class, he's rich as fuck, but an argument could be made that he is motivated by social frustration and political humiliation. I guess you could argue that the Joker, an enemy that is both an overwhelming threat and someone Batman can easily kill, is both strong and weak, but that's pushing it. Batman is a hero, but he rejects the idea of the cult of death and wants to find a peaceful end to his war with the Joker. He certainly isn't impatient to die. Batman is macho, but he doesn't have a disdain for non-standard sexual habits, considering his annoyance at the fact that Abby Holland was arrested in the first place. The feature that most definitively does not apply to this version of Batman is pacifism as trafficking with the enemy. The Killing Joke, Garden of Earthly Delights, Immortal Clay are all stories about Batman seeing the humanity in his enemies and deciding not to fight them. He will fight if he must, but this version of Batman will always try to end things peacefully. So no, this version of Batman is not a fascist. But what if he was? What would a version of Batman who was a fascist look like if written by Moore? Well, we don't have to wonder, because there's already a character written by Alan Moore who is essentially Batman, but he's a fascist, and his name is Rorschach. There are some obvious objections many viewers will have with me saying Rorschach from Watchmen is Batman, but really into fascism. First off, Rorschach wasn't inspired by Batman. He was inspired by The Question and Mr. A, two superheroes created by Steve Ditko. But both of those characters were inspired heavily by Golden Age detective superheroes who themselves were derived from pulp detectives. The thing is, Batman is a Golden Age pulp detective superhero. So while it's incorrect to say that Rorschach was directly inspired by Batman, it's also wrong to pretend they're unrelated. Moore has also described Rorschach as being a more realistic version of Batman, and he has a grappling hook pistol, something that is blatantly taken from Batman. The other counter-argument to this take is that Rorschach isn't a fascist because, much like his Ditko-penned inspirations, he is an objectivist, which is a completely different fringe far-right ideology. Objectivists are quick to tell you that their ideology is actually the furthest thing from fascism because fascists are authoritarians and objectivists hate the government because it undermines the right of the chosen people to dominate others without restraint. And you know what? They're right. It's a shitty far-right ideology, but it isn't the same as fascism. Anyway, let's start reading Watchmen. I'll just start with the opening narration for no reason in particular. Dog carcass in an alley this morning. Tire tread on burst stomach. The city is afraid of me. I have seen its true face. The streets are extended gutters, and the gutters are full of blood, and when the drains finally scab over, all the vermin will drown. The accumulated filth of all their sex and murder will foam up about their waists, and all the whores and politicians will look up and shout, "Save us!" And I'll look down and whisper, "No." They had a choice, all of them. They could have followed in the footsteps of good men like my father, or President Truman. Decent men who believed in a day's work for a day's pay. Instead, they followed the droppings of lechers and communists and didn't realize that the trail led over a precipice until it was too late. Don't tell me they didn't have a choice. Now the whole world stands on the brink, staring down into a bloody hell, all those liberals and intellectuals and smooth talkers, and all of a sudden, nobody can think of anything to say. Oh wow. I genuinely forgot how blatant Rorschach was, right from the get-go. Yeah, Rorschach's a bit of a fascist. I mean, his opening lines show this deep-seated contempt for both the world around him and the people who live in it. He's especially clear in his hatred of sex workers, communists, liberals, and intellectuals, and fantasizes about all of them dying as he watches. The reasons Rorschach is the way he is are told in the 6th issue of the miniseries, The Abyss Gazes also. The boy who would one day become Rorschach, Walter Kovacs, was born in 1940. His mother was an abusive prostitute, leading Walter to be bullied, resulting in him mauling another child and being placed in a home for problem children. His mother was later murdered by a pimp. His only response to this was to say, "Good." Rorschach never knew his father, a client of his mother's named Charlie. He says that his father was a political aide to President Truman, that his mother left him because of his politics, and that he died during World War II. None of these things are true. Rorschach is a famously unreliable narrator, and Truman didn't become president until Rorschach was 5. In 1964, Walter was radicalized by the real-life rape and murder of Kitty Genovese. According to Rorschach, almost 40 people witnessed the murder, but no one did anything. No one called the police. They just stood there and watched as she died. To Rorschach, this was proof of humanity's evil. The thing is, the story of bystander apathy while Kitty Genovese died is an urban legend. There were only a few witnesses, and only 2 of them actually knew she had been stabbed. Multiple people called the police, one person shouted at the killer and scared him off, and another cradled Genovese as she died. Rorschach's entire philosophy is built on a lie. Anyway, Walter became a superhero and continued operating, illegally, after superheroes were banned. In 1975, he found the corpse of a murdered 6-year-old who had been cut up and fed to dogs. Walter snapped and, without showing any emotion, chained the killer to a furnace in a burning building with only a handsaw left to escape with. He stood outside the killer's home and watched it burn. On that day, Walter Kovacs died, and Rorschach, this merciless, nihilistic murderer, was born. Rorschach is a man who believes the world is rotten, that it is an unforgivable, open sewer of death and brutality, and that the only way to fix it is for him to kill every evil person he can find. And as a reminder, he believes that the world is rotten because of liberalism, intellectuals, Marxism, and sex workers. The series begins with Rorschach learning that Eddie Blake, aka the Comedian, an old superhero colleague of his, has been murdered. Rorschach informs the rest of the superhero community, but no one cares. At the end of the first issue, Rorschach acknowledges that the world is on the brink of nuclear war. He ponders, why does one life matter against so many? The thesis of the book is because every life is precious. Because every person has their own life, their own hopes and dreams, their own flaws and virtues. The point of the ending of Watchmen is that Ozymandias' cold calculus is unacceptable, because major portions of the story are spent getting to know people like the Bernards and Dr. Long, who he callously slaughters. The point of Watchmen is that the ends don't justify the means, that every life is as miraculous as lead turning into gold. But that isn't why Rorschach cares that the comedian is dead. He cares because there is good and there is evil, and evil must be punished. Even in the face of Armageddon, he shall not compromise on this. He does not investigate this murder because taking the life of an evil man is unacceptable. He does that constantly. He does it because he wants to find the people who are evil and slit their throats. Because the world is black and white, and it would be so much better if all the bad people just stopped living. And of course, Rorschach is the one who gets to decide who is bad and who is good. And Rorschach's definitions of good and evil are warped, because by any reasonable definition, the comedian was a monster. When Rorschach tells Ozymandias about the comedian's murder, Ozzy says that the man was practically a Nazi. Rorschach says that, instead of selling out like Ozymandias and the others, the comedian stood up for his country. If that makes him a Nazi, you might as well call me a Nazi too, Rorschach says. And you know, sometimes the scripts for these videos just write themselves. To be clear, the comedian isn't a Nazi and neither is Rorschach. The Nazis were a very specific group of German fascists, and the comedian is American. If they're fascists, they're homegrown American fascists, which, as a reminder, have different symbols and targets than German fascists while still believing the same rhetoric. So, is the comedian a fascist? I mean, kinda. He's an assassin who kills communists at the behest of Richard Nixon. Nixon, by the way, had some fascist tendencies in real life. He got elected by appealing to racist white people who despised the civil rights movement and the riots that defined it. Like after that long-ass description of fascism I gave, Nixon's platform of grr, whether or not black people are human beings should be decided by the white supremacists governing the South. I hate that people are rioting for civil rights. Please vote for me, frustrated middle class who has a fear of difference. That should be setting off alarm bells in your head. And of course, once he was elected, he brutally murdered 150,000 civilians in Cambodia. Plus the Watergate stuff, but that's relatively minor when compared to the wholesale slaughter of 150,000 human beings. Richard Nixon never went all the way to becoming a fascist because he hired the dumbest men imaginable to carry out his political schemes, and they got caught like idiots. But in a world like Watchmen, a world where G. Gordon Liddy is a superhero and Nixon wins Vietnam in a week, I could see Nixon consolidating power and becoming far worse. Anyway, the comedian is Nixon's loyal right hand. He assassinates Kennedy, murders children and a pregnant woman in Vietnam, and does it all with a smile on his face. Eddie Blake is a man who loves violence and despises weakness. I don't think he had deep enough thoughts politically to be properly described as a fascist. I think there isn't much more to him behind his nihilism and his love for brutality, but I have no doubt that the comedian would serve fascists loyally. When Rorschach tells Lori about the comedian's death, she points out that he was a fucking rapist. Rorschach waves this off as a moral lapse of a man who died in service to his country. That's the thing about Rorschach. He does not compromise. He does not see the world in shades of gray. But rather than that making him more moral or clear-headed, it forces him to go through mental gymnastics. He idolizes the comedian, so when he learns that the comedian was a rapist, he solves this mental paradox by deciding that rape isn't bad. Rorschach claims he never compromises, but that's a lie. He's a massive, massive hypocrite. If he was actually unwavering in his ideals, he would have killed the comedian himself. He rants about his landlady having children with multiple men and cheating welfare, and tangent, welfare queens aren't real. That is a far-right stereotype often aimed at black women that has never made any fucking sense. Like this idea that people are having children because the cost of childcare in the United States is somehow less than the pennies that the state gives in welfare programs is a cartoonishly stupid thing that Reagan made up to justify slashing social programs. Anyway, he bitches about welfare queens, but he's unemployed and lives off money he borrows from Dan. For a man who rants about a day's work for a day's pay, he sure doesn't work for a living. Then again, he probably considers murder to be his profession. The biggest source of Rorschach's hypocrisy is his admiration for Harry Truman. Rorschach loves Truman because of his daddy issues. He praises the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, arguing that they were justified because otherwise there would have been more war and millions more would have died. Setting aside the fact that the necessity of dropping nukes on Japan is heavily debated by historians, Rorschach changes his mind on whether or not killing civilians to end a war is a good thing later in the book. When Ozymandias does the same thing to New York, Rorschach is rightfully horrified. And I mean, it would be worse if he cheered on teleporting a squid into New York to kill everyone, but the point is, Rorschach isn't a man who never compromises. He's an emotional, irrational man whose justifications are contradictory. That doesn't necessarily make him a fascist, but do you know what pushes him closer to being one? His taste in literature. Rorschach's favorite newspaper, The New Frontiersman, is run by fascists, and I could make a detailed argument about why they are, but instead, I'll just read an excerpt from what again is Rorschach's favorite newspaper. Nova Express, that's a rival magazine by the way, makes many sneering references to costumed heroes as direct descendants of the Ku Klux Klan, but might I point out that, despite what some might view as their later excesses, the Klan originally came into being because decent people have perfectly reasonable fears for the safety of their persons and belongings when forced into proximity with people from a culture far less morally advanced. No, the Klan were not strictly legal, but they did work voluntarily to preserve American culture in areas where there were very real dangers of that culture being overrun and... Actually, I'm not gonna finish that sentence. Jesus Christ. Also, they published this abomination of a political cartoon. These guys are fucking Nazis. So yeah, Rorschach reads fascist newspaper and considers it to be the only publication reputable enough to leave his journal. I mean, they did stumble onto the missing artist thing, broken clock and all that, but still, these guys are fascists. To be fair, we never see Rorschach repeat the worst parts of the New Frontiersman's rhetoric. Rorschach never says anything racist. I'm not saying he isn't racist, but there isn't any concrete evidence in Watchmen that he is. He dislikes Dr. Long, but that seems to be more because he's a psychologist than because he's black. If I were to take a guess, I would say Rorschach is a man who isn't outwardly racist, but has a lot of deep-seated racist beliefs. Like, he definitely doesn't have progressive views on race, but I feel like he falls more into the level of racism stereotypical of the average white boomer, more than the level of the racism of the KKK fanboys he admires. Like, I bet he's a guy who thinks black people should be allowed to vote, but will get pissed at protests over police racism, but that's just a guess. This video is very critical of Rorschach, but the thing is, I actually think he's a really well-written and complex character, and there is a certain amount of respect I have for his death. Dan, Laurie, and Dr. Manhattan all accept Ozymandias' crimes and agree to stay silent, but Rorschach refuses. He will not compromise, not about something so important, even if refusing to compromise means he dies. Although, there is another interpretation of Rorschach, that he wanted to die, that he had been in pain for so long and just wanted it to end, and that standing up to Dr. Manhattan at the end was just a way for him to die with honor. This interpretation is the one Alan Moore has of Rorschach's death. Let's return to our definitions of fascism. First up, Paxton's passions. Sense of overwhelming crisis beyond the reach of traditional solutions? Definitely. The primacy of the group? Not really. Rorschach is an individual who does things alone. This is the biggest counter to the idea that he's a fascist. that he doesn't think of himself as part of a group. You can argue that his group is superheroes, but he despises other superheroes, and he certainly doesn't believe in the superiority of white people or Americans, given his contempt for pretty much everyone. The newspaper he reads does, but it's a lot more debatable that Rorschach does. To believe the one's group is a victim, a sentiment that justifies any action without legal or moral limits against its enemies, I would argue that this one actually fits Rorschach even though the last one didn't. He believes that good people like him have been victimized by monsters and that any action without moral limits is justified against those monsters. Dread of the group's decline under the corrosive effects of individualist liberalism, class conflict, and alien influences? Yeah, the first page of Watchmen is him ranting that society is declining because of liberals and communists. The need for a closer integration of a purer community? No. The need for authority? Not really. The superiority of the leader's instincts over abstract and universal reason? He certainly believes in the superiority of his own instincts, but he isn't a leader. The beauty of violence and the efficacy of will? Yes, 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 yes. He fits that to a T. The right of the chosen people to dominate others without restraint from any kind of human or divine law? He doesn't believe in restraint, but he also doesn't believe he's part of a chosen people. Next, let's go over Echo's features of fascism. The cult of tradition, he believes in the traditional values of the 40s and Golden Age heroes. Rejection of modernism, definitely. Action for action's sake, definitely, including the hatred of intellectuals Echo wrote about. Disagreement is treason, he has a black and white way of thinking, and views anyone who treats the world with nuance and moral grayness as an enemy. Rorschach does not believe in distinctions, so yeah, I think this applies. Fear of difference? Again, he reads the KKK newspaper, so probably, but I can't say for certain. Appeal to a frustrated middle class? Sorta, but it doesn't fit perfectly. The idea behind the sixth feature of fascism is that fascists appeal to people suffering from an economic crisis, political humiliation, or fears of pressures from lower social groups. Rorschach isn't middle class, he's decidedly poor, but his backstory features this deep-seated humiliation turned to individual frustration. He is driven to these far-right beliefs because of this frustration, even if it doesn't fit perfectly. Obsession with the plot? This is kind of weird because he is obsessed with the plot, but also there definitely is a plot. Except when Echo says the plot, he's talking about xenophobia, and Rorschach isn't obsessed with xenophobia. He's xenophobic, but he doesn't think that the conspiracy is Jewish people. I don't know whether or not to count this one. The enemy is at the same time strong and weak? He believes that the rot of society as a whole is an unassailable problem, while individual criminals are easily defeated losers, which is kind of the opposite of what Echo describes. It's, they are strong, but we will defeat them because they are weak, not, they are weak, but they are still too strong for me to defeat. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy because life is permanent warfare? That's Rorschach in a nutshell. Popular elitism? Rorschach isn't aristocratic and doesn't look down on his underlings because he doesn't have underlings. Everyone is educated to become a hero? Yes! Rorschach is impatient to die. Machismo? Rorschach is misogynistic, hates sex workers, and it's kinda implied that he doesn't like gay people. Selective populism? I'm not sure on this one. He does treat people as a monolithic entity expressing a common will, but also, he fucking hates them instead of claiming to speak for them. And finally, newspeak. Rorschach does have an impoverished vocabulary and weird syntax, but I think that's more of a character quirk than a purposeful constraining of language to limit critical reasoning. So, is Rorschach a fascist? Kinda, I'd say he is. He doesn't fit the definitions perfectly, but he fits them enough for it to be uncomfortable. I think the things that keep Rorschach from being a definite fascist are the fact that he's a loner and the fact that he doesn't believe himself to be part of a superior group. If he did, there would be no question in my mind that he was a fascist. He doesn't, but still, I think he's close enough to fascism to justifiably be called a fascist. And to return to the ostensible topic of this video, you can see how Rorschach and Batman are different, right? The lack of mercy, the black and white thinking, the underlying contempt for others, the worship of tradition and hatred of modernity, these are things that push Rorschach down the path of fascism. And Batman usually lacks these traits. I mean, there's one version of Batman who has them, but the video where I discuss that won't come out for a while. Speaking of videos coming out, I have a surprise for you. The second part of this miniseries is actually going to come out 1 hour after this one. 2 video essays in 1 day. That makes up for the fact that part 3 will take multiple months to make. In the second part, I will talk a lot more about who Batman is as a person and what makes him click as I tackle the definitive Batman adaptation. The one starring Kevin Conroy. No, not that one. The other one. No, not that one either. I'm obviously talking about Batman the Animated Series. Like I said, the definitive version, like that is what should have came to mind. Like, part 2, I'm talking about Batman the Animated Series. This part 1 is over now.